we started off and we created a static map of only the countries and drawn them without any of the data from our World Cup attendances. The next improvement we've made is that we added bubbles or circles corresponding to the home country and the total attendance for that year, making what's often called a thematic map by combining our static geographic map with some data, the theme, in our case, being the World Cup. The next step of this improvement was to create the stem of our martini glass in an author-driven narrative where we leveraged animation to cycle through all the years of the World Cup, displaying both the participating countries and teams and where the World Cup was hosted and what its attendance was. And remember, through both the animation and the negative space created by only showing the participating teams, we could see that in the early tournaments of the World Cup, the participating teams and countries were often localized to where the tournament was held. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of causes for this, and I don't want to fall victim to confusing correlation with a cause, but an intuitive explanation is that world travel wasn't what it is today, and crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, especially before airplanes became commonplace, could be considered quite difficult. The second takeaway from our author-driven narrative is that in addition to conveying how the attendances of the World Cup have changed over the years, is that we could see in the early days, the World Cup was mainly hosted either in South America or Europe. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why South America and European teams often dominate the World Cup, both historically and in modern tournaments. And the fourth iteration of our map was to enable a reader-driven narrative through interaction. We did so by adding buttons which correspond to every year of the World Cup, so that a reader who might be interested in one year as compared to another could very easily see how the participants and the attendances and the host country, or rather what data we have represented on our map, has changed from one year to the next. This also enabled us to compare disjoint years which may not be sequential. For example, comparing 1938's games with 1982's games. Through animation alone, we would have to wait for the entire sequence to go through, and we may not be able to remember what it looked like in 1938 compared to the year of interest unless we've seen the animation go through many, many times. So while in the author-driven narrative, we've communicated our interesting insights from the World Cup games, be it that early tournaments were often localized in the participating countries, and the tournament mainly started off both being hosted in South America and Europe, but also having many of the participating countries from South America or Europe, which might be a reason for their dominance in the games today. They've simply been doing it for longer. The reader-driven narrative allows the user to approach our visualization and discover their own story. And by combining both the author-driven portion and the reader-driven, we've created a very powerful and dynamic story around the history of the World Cup. And returning to our martini glass, remember that the static map and the bubble map, or thematic map, create a very solid foundation for our interactive narrative to come. Our author-driven narrative, enabled by animation, took our reader along a narrow stem of the glass, conveying the interesting stories that we found in the data, before the interaction of our graphic enabled them to explore and discover their own insights in our data through our reader-driven narrative. And through all of these components, we've created an engaging and effective visualization.